Attention people who teach the Bible to children. There may be things about Moses that you have forgotten. Please pay attention to the following video.
Hi, that was my intro, man. And now I'm Nathan. Welcome to this amazing video. Here's what I want to do is I want to tell you 5 things that you may or may not know about Moses, but each of them are totally true. So the next time you teach a Sunday school lesson or maybe you preach a sermon, I want you to remember these 5 things because they will take Moses from like here and it'll take your story like at least here. I mean, maybe even like up here. I mean, it might just be amazing. Okay? So these 5 things, in all seriousness, they will give your story of Moses some definition and some life. He'll become an interesting real character and not just a series of like 4 events in the Bible that make him sound like he's not a real person. Because oftentimes that's what happens. Like, we explain Zacchaeus like he was in a tree, and then Jesus called to him, and then he came down, and then they had dinner, and then Zacchaeus said, "I'm sorry." Like, all of that stuff is true, but that's not how you would tell a friend a story of something amazing that would happen. You would weave in details. You would include particulars of the story. But those kind of things can be a little difficult to come across, especially in the biblical narrative. And something I've actually been learning recently is that Jewish literature, especially of that time, it's very typical of Jewish literature to not provide a lot of extra detail. It was meant to be meditated on and to think about almost because it was so simple, it was meant to be thought about more. So in the Bible, we have a lot of stories that don't have a lot of detail right on the page, but I think we can tease out some things that are true. And then I think also we can think through some situations that very likely, very possibly happened. So let's start with the first one, okay? The first one's pretty simple, but if you think about it, it has big implications. Moses was adopted. We all know Moses was put in the basket, he was put in the Nile, and then he was eventually picked up by a princess, right? He was picked up by Pharaoh's daughter. And we all hear that story, but do we actually think about the fact that Moses, one of the heroes of the Old Testament, one of the heroes of the faith, didn't actually grow up with his own family? I think when we're preaching or when we're teaching kids, we need to start the story of Moses with the fact that he may not have known who his real mom was. There's a very good possibility he didn't know his mom. And there's a really good chance he probably never lived with his mom and dad. Remember, he grew up in the palace in Egypt. So he grew up as an adopted kid. And so when we're talking to adopted children or we're talking to kids who, well, I live with my grandmother. Well, I don't live with my parents. I live with so-and-so. The story of Moses is like your story. The story of Moses is less like my story than it is like the kids who were adopted. How crazy is that, right? The story of Moses, one of the most famous historical figures in all of the Old Testament, is a story of an adopted kid. If you let that sink in, that's pretty amazing. That means that God can use me, the adopted kid, me, the kid without a perfect home. The Bible is littered with those people. All right, so first of all, Moses was adopted. Second of all, and again, all these things are going to be things that maybe you've heard before, but have you let all these things sink in? Have you really leveraged them to teach an amazing story? Number 2, Moses killed a guy. Not only was he adopted, he was a murderer. Exodus 2, verse 11 and 12. In the course of time, Moses grew up. Then he went to see his own people and watched them suffering under forced labor. He saw a Hebrew, one of his own people, being beaten by an Egyptian. Verse 12. He looked all around, and when he didn't see anyone, he beat the Egyptian to death and hid the body in the sand. That's the story of Moses. That is in Scripture. That's Exodus 2, 11 and 12. You talk about a relatable guy. If Moses were alive today, he would be in prison. And we're talking about a hero of the faith here. Now, obviously, when we teach kids, we have to be careful with this topic because we don't want to promote such behavior. But let's not think Moses was perfect. Far from it. He did some terrible things. And it was because of this that he eventually flees the palace where he grew up. And he spends years taking care of sheep on a mountain. That's an amazing truth that Moses, a hero of the faith, killed a guy. And yet, that's not even the beginning of what most of us think of when we think of Moses. We think of the basket, and then we go straight to leading the people out of Egypt and eventually to the entrance of the promised land. But this guy killed somebody. Bet you didn't think about that before. All right, so number 1, Moses was adopted. Number 2, Moses killed a guy. Number 3, Moses couldn't use them words very well. Exodus chapter 4. It says, Moses said to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past, nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." Moses couldn't use them words very well. Now, we can't read too much into this. I don't know what that means. But if you just think for a minute of the implications of that, I am slow of speech and tongue. So either he had trouble using words, maybe he stuttered, maybe he was difficult to listen to. But Moses, the commanding leader, couldn't speak well. He even says, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past. So in other words, Lord, remember, he's talking to the burning bush here. He's talking to God in the burning bush. He says, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past. So God, you remember the past, right? I wasn't eloquent back then. And not since you've started speaking to me, I haven't been eloquent. In other words, Lord, even as you speak to me, I'm having trouble talking. So you want me to talk to Pharaoh? See, we think of Moses marching in to see Pharaoh. I am Moses and I'm going to throw down my rod. No, he says, I don't speak well. Are you sure you want to use me? I think throughout the story of Moses, if we drop in that idea that he couldn't talk well, he wasn't a great speaker, we'll think of Moses less like Martin Luther, I have seen the mountain, right? I have been to the mountaintop. Mine eyes have seen the glory. It's my favorite sermon. It's the night before he died. It's so good. By the way, if you ever want a great snippet on the prodigal son. I mean, sorry, not the prodigal son. The parable of the two the leaders that passed by. Oh, the Good Samaritan. There we go. Thought of it. That speech by Martin Luther is fantastic. But anyway, Moses was less like Martin Luther, and he was more like some of us, right? Couldn't speak well. And yet, he was adopted. He killed a guy. He couldn't speak well. Excuse me. Oh, it's the tea coming back to bite me. Amidst all that, God still used him. Chapters and chapters of the Bible are devoted to this man, Moses. And he was adopted. He was a murderer who couldn't talk very well. Number 4, we often forget that Moses was Egyptian. He grew up in an Egyptian household. Remember, he was raised by the princess, by the Pharaoh's daughter. So this is really interesting because when Moses comes back to Egypt to talk to Pharaoh, who better than him to stand before Pharaoh? He probably knows protocol. He probably knows the language. Because remember, he was a Jew, but he was born, and as a baby, he was given to an Egyptian. So his first language may have well been Egyptian. So he may have known the language that Pharaoh spoke better than any of his family, any of his Jewish friends, maybe than many of the people who were slaves in Egypt. Moses was particularly positioned so that when he walks into Pharaoh to see Pharaoh, he can speak to Pharaoh in his language perfectly. No translator needed. And he stood before Pharaoh. He knew probably how to get to Pharaoh, because who would know the palace better than the boy who grew up in the palace, right? All these little threads God's putting together, and things we don't often think about, but that make a huge difference. And all of a sudden, Moses he isn't just a hero of the faith in Hebrews 11. He's a real-life, adopted murderer who can't talk well, raised as an Egyptian. And then last of all, let's swing to the opposite end of the spectrum here. Moses was an old dude when he got started. Remember how we talked earlier about how we start with the basket, and then we basically take Moses' life and skip to at least the burning bush? He was probably about 80 years old, 80, when the episode of the burning bush happened. He was like grandfather age when that happened. And that's really the beginning of his leadership, is the burning bush. We often talk more about what happened after Moses' 80th birthday than we talk about what happened before. How amazing is that? So, grandparents out there, or those of you that are talking to grandparents, Moses was just getting started when he was 80. So that's encouraging for a lot of people who feel like, well, my life is over. I've hit retirement age. Or maybe I've hit my midlife. I guess my good years are behind me. God said, Moses, you're perfect. You're 80 years old. I'm ready to use you in a powerful way. That is really, really cool. I think this also, for kids' sake, it would be great to show kids a picture of an 80-year-old. Ideally, an 80-year-old Jewish guy, not a white guy. For those of us that are like me, and you tend to picture other people like yourself. Like Moses was raised an Egyptian, and he was Jewish. he probably didn't look like me, is all I'm saying. But what if you showed your kids an 80-year-old Jewish man? That would be really cool. That would change a lot of their perspective, especially in America. That would change their perspective on maybe what Moses looked like. And of course, you can say this is not actually what Moses looked like, but that would do a number on the kids', imaginations, because a lot of the illustrations we see today are of a bunch of white dudes, and that really bums me out because I don't think that the Bible is full of white men. Sorry. So anyway, I think those are 5 things that we often forget about Moses, but that are super powerful when it comes to storytelling and when it comes to making the Bible come alive to kids and maybe even to adults. If you have something that you think makes the story of Moses interesting, would you comment below and let me know? I'd love to hear it. I don't think these are all of the things, certainly, or else this video would be 4.5 billion hours long. But I think these are a couple of the key ones. But I want to know, comment below, what are some of the things that I missed? All right. My name is Nathan. My shirt says this way: want a taco about Jesus? Let us pray. Found it online. My sister actually found it. I thought it was hilarious, so I'm wearing it. I feel like it's appropriate for tonight, for this video. And anyway, I'm Nathan from BetterBibleTeachers.com. If you're looking for interesting Sunday school curriculum that doesn't follow the normal, invite kids into class and then put them to sleep with your lesson, feel free to check out BetterBibleTeachers.com. Anyway, 5 things about Moses I think are awesome. Until the next time, I will see you later.